what medieval pet ownership was actually like, and more. Ever wonder what it was like to have a pet before Instagram, TikTok, or even dog parks existed? You might think medieval people were too busy with plagues and nights to cuddle with a furry friend, but prepare to be surprised. What if I told you their pet-owning habits weren't so different from yours? The common perception of the Middle Ages is one of stark, unyielding hardship, a world of mud, toil, and survival, where sentimentality was a luxury few could afford. We picture a landscape populated by beasts of burden, the powerful warhorse, its breath misting in the cold morning air as it carries a steel-clad knight, the stoic ox, straining against its yoke to pull a heavy plow through thick, unforgiving clay, the utilitarian mouser, a fleeting shadow in the barn, its worth measured only in the number of vermin it dispatched. In this grim tableau, there seems to be little room for the concept of an animal as a cherished companion, a member of the family, kept simply for the joy and comfort it provides. We imagine a world governed by a harsh and relentless pragmatism, where every living creature had to earn its keep through labor, protection, or as an eventual source of food. The idea of a pampered poodle with a jeweled collar, a beloved cat sleeping at the foot of the bed, or a talking parrot in a gilded cage, feels jarringly modern, an anachronism better suited to our own age of designer dog breeds and gourmet pet food. But what if this picture, this monochrome etching of medieval life, is incomplete? What if, beneath the surface of this utilitarian world, the human-animal bond was just as strong, just as complex, and in some cases, just as indulgent as it is today? The hidden history of medieval pet ownership reveals a world teeming with unexpected affection and surprising parallels to our own. It's a history that challenges our assumptions and brings a touch of warmth and familiarity to an era that can often feel alien and remote. This is not a story about livestock or working animals, in the strictest sense, but about the creatures who crossed the threshold from the barn to the hearth, from the fields to the great halls of power, and found a place not just in the homes, but in the hearts of medieval people. It is a story that proves the desire for companionship, for a bond that is loyal, non-judgmental, and pure, is not a recent invention, but a fundamental aspect of the human experience, stretching back through the centuries. Imagine for a moment a modern cat cafe, the air filled with the scent of coffee and the gentle rumbling purr of a dozen felines. Patrons sip their lattes, scroll through their phones, and reach out to stroke a passing calico. It feels like the pinnacle of contemporary, urban pet culture. Now, let us pivot that image 1,000 years into the past. Picture a scholar in a cold monastery scriptorium on a remote Irish island. The only sounds are the scratching of his quill on vellum and the sighing of the wind against the stone walls. His brow is furrowed in concentration as he painstakingly copies a delicate, illuminated manuscript, his life's work. Curled up asleep on a corner of the precious vellum, leaving a tiny, inky paw print for future historians to discover, is his cat, a white-furred companion he calls Pangur Ban. This isn't a flight of fancy. It's a scene immortalized in a real 9th century Irish poem, a tender and intimate snapshot of a man and his pet, finding quiet companionship in their shared, parallel tasks. The scholar hunting for the glimmer of knowledge in ancient texts, the cat hunting for the flicker of a mouse in the shadows. This single image, a testament to a bond of quiet, everyday affection, opens a window into a forgotten world where animals were far more than just their function. This exploration into medieval pet ownership is a journey into the heart of the unexpected. It is about uncovering the solid, historical evidence of pampered pooches who wore collars of velvet and silver, of cats who were not just tolerated mousers, but were mourned upon their death, and of noble ladies who kept squirrels and monkeys as delightful, exotic companions. It's about discovering that medieval people commissioned portraits with their pets, wrote heartfelt poems about them, and even risked the wrath of the church for what was seen as lavishing too much affection and too many resources on their animal friends. We will find that the desire for animal companionship, for that unique, non-judgmental, and loyal bond, is not a modern invention. It is a deeply ingrained human impulse that transcended the vastly different, often brutal circumstances of the medieval world. From the peasant's humble, smoke-filled cottage, where a scruffy terrier stood as a vigilant and furry guardian, to the king's court, where graceful greyhounds were living symbols of noble status, animals were woven into the very fabric of daily life, in ways that were both deeply practical and profoundly emotional. Prepare to meet the surprisingly modern, medieval pet owners, and in doing so, you may find that when it comes to the simple, pure love of a pet, the centuries that separate us seem to melt away into insignificance. When we think of medieval animals, our minds typically conjure images of powerful destriers carrying knights into battle, oxen pulling heavy plows through muddy fields, or perhaps a falcon perched regally on a nobleman's gloved fist. These were animals of purpose, their value measured in strength, speed, and skill. Yet, alongside this world of utilitarian creatures, there existed a far more intimate and surprising menagerie of animals kept not for their utility, but for the sheer delight of their companionship. The medieval pet was a far more diverse and fascinating category than one might imagine, a testament to the human capacity for finding connection with the animal kingdom in all its forms. This world of pet ownership was, however, deeply stratified, a mirror reflecting the rigid social hierarchy of the time. The type of animal one kept, the way it was treated, and even the very possibility of owning a pet for pleasure were all dictated by one's station in life, from the king in his castle to the peasant in his wattle and daub hut. For the aristocracy of the Middle Ages, pets were both a source of personal affection and a powerful statement of status, wealth, and worldliness. The ability to keep and care for an animal that served no practical purpose was, in itself, the ultimate luxury. While hunting dogs and falcons were indispensable to the aristocratic lifestyle, prized for their skill and lineage, a different class of animal companion occupied the castles and manor houses, living a life of pampered ease. Dogs, of course, were ubiquitous, but a clear distinction was made between the working hounds of the hunt and the smaller, more refined lapdogs, known as comforter dogs or gredens. These tiny canines, often resembling modern spaniels, terriers, or Maltese breeds, were the cherished companions of noblewomen. Imagine a great hall in a French castle in the 14th century. The air is thick with the smoke from a central hearth, the stone walls covered with rich tapestries depicting heroic hunts and biblical scenes. Seated in a high-backed wooden chair is the lady of the castle, her gown a cascade of deep blue velvet. In her lap, nestled comfortably, is a small white dog named Bijou, a living, breathing accessory. He was small enough to be carried, to be cuddled as she sat by the fire, listening to a traveling minstrel, or to be tucked into the voluminous sleeves of her gown, a little pocket of warmth against the pervasive chill of the stone fortress. Their purpose was purely emotional, and even, it was believed, medicinal. It was a common belief that these small, warm bodies could draw out sickness from their human companions, easing stomach ailments and providing a form of living hot water bottle during a time of rudimentary medicine and constant physical discomfort. Chaucer's prioress in the Canterbury Tales is a famous literary example of this trend, a character drawn from the life he observed around him. She is depicted as a woman of exquisite, if perhaps misplaced, sensitivity, a person who would weep if one of her smale hounds were dead, or if someone had struck it with a stick. He tells us that she fed them only the finest food, roasted flesh, milk, and wastel bread, a fine white bread that was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. This was a diet far superior to that of most human peasants in the kingdom. This detail, meant by Chaucer to be a subtle critique of her worldly priorities and her neglect of her Christian duty to the poor, nonetheless provides a clear window into the reality of how these aristocratic pets were treated. They were, for all intents and purposes, furry, four-legged members of the nobility, their comfort and well-being a matter of daily concern. Cats also found a comfortable place in noble households, though their status was always more ambiguous than that of the dog. While universally valued for their prowess as mousers in a world where grain stores were vital and pests were a constant threat, many were clearly regarded with a deep and genuine affection. Illuminated manuscripts, the lavishly decorated books of the wealthy, frequently depict cats in domestic scenes. In the margins of a prayer book, you might find a drawing of a kitten chasing a string, or a mother cat wrestling playfully with her offspring. In larger illustrations, a cat might be seen lounging contentedly by the hearth, a picture of domestic tranquility. For a noble family, a well-fed, glossy-coated cat was another sign of a well-run, prosperous household. They moved with a silent grace through the private chambers, a living, purring ornament that added a touch of warmth and life to the often drafty and imposing stone castles. The Marchioness of Mantua, Isabella d'Este, a prominent figure of the Italian Renaissance, famously adored her cats. When one of her favorites, a cat named Martino, died, her grief was so profound that she had her diplomat in Bologna commission a magnificent Majolica-ware tomb for him, a testament to his cherished place in her life. Perhaps most indicative of the aristocracy's love for novelty and status were the exotic pets they collected. This was the ultimate form of conspicuous consumption, a way to display not just wealth, but also connections to far-flung, almost magical lands. Monkeys, often imported at great expense from North Africa, were particularly popular in the courts of France, Italy, and England. They were intelligent, mischievous, and endlessly amusing. A monkey in the Great Hall was living entertainment. They were often dressed in miniature versions of human clothing, tiny velvet doublets and jaunty hats, and taught to perform tricks, mimicking the courtiers around them. They appear frequently in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, a testament to their very real presence in wealthy homes, where they served as living jesters, status symbols, and surprisingly affectionate companions. Owning a monkey was a way of showing that your reach, your power, and your wealth extended all the way to the edges of the known world. Birds, too, were highly prized for their beauty and song. While common folk might raise pigeons and doves for food, the nobility kept songbirds like linnets, goldfinches, and nightingales in ornate, decorative cages for the simple pleasure of their music. Their beautiful songs provided a natural soundtrack to daily life within the castle walls, a constant and gentle reminder of nature's beauty. Even more coveted were parrots and parakeets, imported at enormous cost from the distant lands of Africa and India. Their vibrant plumage was a source of wonder, but their ability to mimic human speech was seen as nothing short of magical. A talking bird was an undeniable symbol of wealth and connection to the wider world. It was a living marvel, a source of endless fascination, and a conversation piece that could hold a room captive. The effort and expense required to transport such a delicate creature across thousands of miles of dangerous sea and land, and then to keep it alive and healthy in a European climate, was a staggering display of power. Even more surprising to the modern mind was the medieval fashion for keeping squirrels. These native woodland creatures, so familiar to us as residents of parks and gardens, were captured young and tamed, becoming affectionate and surprisingly playful companions. They were particularly popular with noble women who doted on them. They would commission custom-made, delicate silver chains and tiny, intricate collars for their squirrels, sometimes adorned with pearls or little bells that would jingle as the creature scampered across a lady's shoulders. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, the wife of King Charles VI of France, was known to have had several pet squirrels. Court records show that she ordered elaborate fur-lined nests for them to sleep in. This trend highlights the medieval desire to tame a piece of the wild, to bring a charming and sprightly creature from the untamed forest into the highly ordered domestic sphere of the castle, transforming it into a symbol of gentle and refined living. Ferrets, now more commonly associated with hunting rabbits, were also kept as pets by the aristocracy. Their sleek, sinuous bodies and their playful, inquisitive natures made them entertaining companions. Like squirrels, they were often fitted with decorative collars and leashes, treated as cherished members of the household menagerie. The Duke of Berry, one of the most powerful and wealthy nobles of 14th century France, was renowned for his extensive collection of animals, which went far beyond simple pets. His menagerie included not just hounds, falcons, and ferrets, but also camels, an ostrich, and even a polar bear gifted to him by another royale. His famous Book of Hours, the Très Riche Heures du Duc de Berry, is filled with illustrations that showcase this deep connection to the animal world. Dogs of all shapes and sizes are scattered throughout its pages, a constant and affectionate presence in the depiction of ducal life, whether at a grand feast or a simple fireside scene. These were not just animals. They were an integral part of the fabric of aristocratic identity. The relationship between the clergy and pets was a complex and often contradictory one. On one hand, the strict monastic rules of poverty, chastity, and obedience seemed to leave little room for the worldly indulgence of keeping an animal for pleasure. On the other hand, the quiet, contemplative, and often intensely lonely life of a monk, nun, or scholar made the companionship of an animal particularly appealing, and, some might argue, even necessary for their well-being. Cats were by far the most common and accepted clerical pets. Their presence in monasteries and convents was easily justified by their practical skill as mousers. In a world before modern printing, books were painstakingly copied by hand onto vellum, a processed animal skin that was, unfortunately, a favorite food of mice and rats. A single rodent could undo months of a scribe's labor, overnight. Therefore, a cat in the scriptorium was not a pet, but a guardian of knowledge, a furry protector of the sacred texts. Similarly, in the monastery's kitchen and granary, a cat was the most effective form of pest control available. But the bond often went far deeper than mere utility. The aforementioned 9th century Irish poem about the monk and his cat, Pan Gur Ban, is a perfect expression of this affectionate partnership. The anonymous monk, in a moment of quiet reflection, looks at his cat and sees a kindred spirit. He celebrates his cat as a fellow scholar, one who practices his own craft of hunting with the same silent dedication that the monk applies to his studies. There is no sense of ownership or dominance in the poem, but rather a feeling of mutual respect and quiet camaraderie. The monk writes, "So we are ever, Pangurban and I, in our arts, we find our bliss. I have mine and he has his." Numerous anecdotes and manuscript illuminations support this view, showing monks and nuns with cats on their laps, sharing their warmth and quiet presence during long hours of prayer or study. However, the church authorities often took a dim view of this practice, particularly when it came to nuns in their convents. Religious reformers and stern bishops frequently issued injunctions against nuns keeping pets, viewing the practice as a dangerous distraction from their spiritual duties and a clear violation of their sacred vow of poverty. The Ancrain Riul, a famous 13th century guide written for anchoresses, religious women who chose to live in complete seclusion, famously permitted the keeping of a single cat, but strictly forbade any other beast. This small concession is telling. It acknowledges the profound human need for companionship, even for a woman who has renounced the world, while simultaneously trying to limit what was seen as a potential slide into worldly attachment and frivolous sentimentality. The fact that these prohibitions against pets had to be issued over and over again throughout the centuries strongly suggests that they were widely and consistently ignored. Nuns continued to keep not just their useful cats, but also small dogs, squirrels, and songbirds, smuggling a little bit of affection and life into their otherwise austere and cloistered existence. For some religious figures, especially hermits and those who would later be recognized as saints, a deep connection with animals was seen not as a worldly indulgence, but as a sign of their profound holiness. It was believed that their purity of soul and their closeness to God allowed them to exist in perfect harmony with nature, recreating on a small scale the kind of Edenic peace that existed before humanity's fall from grace. Saint Francis of Assisi is the most famous example, of course, known for preaching to the birds and taming the savage wolf of Gubbio. But there were many other similar stories that were popular and widely believed. Saint Columba, an Irish abbot, was said to have a beloved white horse that, according to his biographer, came to him and wept, laying its head in his lap upon sensing its master's impending death. Saint Jerome was famously depicted with a lion, from whose paw he had removed a thorn, the fearsome beast becoming his loyal companion in the wilderness. These stories, whether literally true or not, reveal a deep-seated belief that a special bond with animals was a mark of spiritual grace, a stark contrast to the more common clerical view of pets as a sinful and worldly luxury. For the vast majority of the medieval population, the peasants, serfs, and simple townspeople who made up the backbone of society, the concept of owning a pet purely for pleasure was an almost unimaginable luxury. Life for them was a daily, grinding struggle for survival, and every mouth to feed had to justify its existence through work. Animals were an absolutely essential part of the peasant economy, but they were working partners, not pampered companions in the aristocratic sense. Dogs, sturdy and resilient, guarded the family's humble cottage from thieves and predators, herded their few sheep on the common lands, and sometimes helped in hunting small game like rabbits to supplement the meager family diet. Cats were indispensable, the silent, tireless guardians of the small grain stores, protecting the family's food supply from the constant threat of vermin. Yet, to assume that these relationships were devoid of affection would be a profound mistake. In the close quarters of peasant life, the lines between utility and companionship were often completely blurred. A peasant and his dog worked together from sunrise to sunset, slept near the same fire for warmth, and relied on each other for safety and success. A deep bond of trust and mutual dependence would have naturally formed over years of shared existence. While the dog might not have worn a velvet collar, and its name was more likely to be Sturdy than Bijou, it was still a valued member of the household. Archaeological evidence from medieval peasant dwellings has uncovered the remains of dogs and cats, buried with apparent care, sometimes near the home, suggesting they were mourned upon their death and not simply discarded. Etiquette and legal records provide further, fascinating clues into these relationships. Some medieval etiquette guides, written for those aspiring to better manners, found it necessary to explicitly instruct diners not to stroke their dogs or cats at the table, nor to feed them directly from their plates. The very existence of such a rule proves that this was a common and tempting behavior. It points to a widespread, everyday impulse towards casual affection that transcended social class. Similarly, legal texts from the period lay out specific fines for stealing or injuring another person's dog or cat, acknowledging their value to the owner beyond their simple market price as a working animal. This value was not just economic, it was deeply personal. The types of dogs owned by commoners were typically sturdy, mongrel breeds, often referred to as curs. They were not the elegant, long-limbed greyhounds of the nobility. In fact, in many parts of Europe, particularly in England after the Norman conquest, peasants were forbidden by strict forest laws from owning dogs that were large or fast enough to hunt deer, as the hunt was the exclusive and jealously guarded privilege of the king and his lords. To enforce this, a peasant's dog living near a royal forest often had to be lawed, a painful and crippling process that involved the partial removal of its claws or cutting the tendons of its foot to slow it down and prevent it from chasing game. The fact that peasants continued to keep dogs even under these restrictive and often cruel conditions speaks volumes about their importance for guarding, herding, and, one can only assume, companionship. While the extravagant pampering seen in aristocratic circles was entirely absent from the peasant's life, the fundamental emotional connection was not. A cat that curled up with the children for warmth on a cold winter night, a dog that greeted its owner with a frantic wagging tail after a long and grueling day in the fields. These were small but significant sources of comfort and joy in a life that was often filled with hardship, hunger, and loss. The peasant's pet may not have been an exotic status symbol, but it was a loyal companion, a silent witness to the daily struggles and simple pleasures of medieval life. In this shared, difficult existence, a bond was forged that was every bit as real and meaningful as the one between a queen and her lapdog. The modern pet industry is a multi-billion-dollar behemoth, a global marketplace offering everything from organic, grain-free food to orthopedic memory, foam beds, designer clothing for every season, and even high-tech gadgets to keep our furry friends entertained while we are at work. We see this as a distinctly modern phenomenon, a product of our affluent post-industrial society, where pets are often treated as fur babies. But the impulse to pamper and provide for our animal companions, to go far beyond their basic needs for survival, is far from new. A deep dive into the historical record of the Middle Ages reveals a surprising and fascinating culture of elaborate pet care, at least among the wealthy elite who could afford such indulgences. For the dogs, cats, and other creatures lucky enough to find themselves in a royal court or a noble manor, life could be one of astonishing luxury, filled with special diets, bespoke accessories, and dedicated human servants. This level of care challenges our perception of the medieval world as universally harsh and demonstrates that the desire to lavish affection and money on a beloved pet is a timeless human trait. For the majority of animals in the Middle Ages, diet was a matter of survival. Working dogs on a farm and cats in a peasant's cottage would have eaten whatever they could scavenge or catch, supplemented by whatever scraps and leftovers their human family could spare. But for the prized pets of the aristocracy, feeding time was a far more elaborate affair, with menus carefully considered for their health, taste, and refinement. This was not about simply filling a belly. It was about maintaining a valuable asset and expressing affection through the quality of the food provided. The hunting hounds of a noble estate were highly valuable, the result of careful breeding and years of training. Their diet was a matter of great importance, codified in detailed hunting manuals written by the nobles themselves. Gaston Phébus, the sophisticated Count of Foix, wrote a famous and widely circulated 14th century treatise on hunting, Livre de Chasse, in which he dedicated significant attention to the proper care and feeding of his dogs. He prescribed a daily diet of good quality bran bread, which was to be baked specifically for the dogs. This bread was often to be soaked in a rich broth, or mixed with meat from the hunt to make it more palatable and nutritious. He insisted that their water should be fresh and clean, changed at least twice a day, and that they should be fed in clean wooden bowls, never on the dirty floor. This wasn't just about keeping the dogs alive. It was a scientifically minded approach, for its time, to maintaining them in peak physical condition, a practice akin to the specialized diets of modern professional athletes. The small lapdogs of noble women received even more delicate fare, meals designed to please their supposedly refined palates. As Chaucer observed of his prioress, these dogs were fed on roasted meats, fine white bread, and fresh milk. These were not scraps from the master's table, but meals prepared specifically for them by the kitchen staff, often of a higher quality than the food eaten by the human servants in the same household. A cook might spend his morning preparing a grand feast for the lord and his guests, and his afternoon carefully mincing roasted chicken for the lady's favorite spaniel. There was also a rudimentary but clear understanding of special dietary needs. Sickly or recovering animals were often prescribed restorative broths, soft, easily digestible foods, or special tonics. A common remedy for an ailing dog was warm goat's milk mixed with bread, a gentle and nourishing meal believed to help the animal regain its strength. This careful attention to nutrition shows a genuine concern for the animal's well-being and a belief that a proper diet was essential to its health, happiness, and longevity. Even cats, who were often expected to earn their keep by mousing, could be the recipients of special meals in a prosperous household. They would have been given bowls of fresh milk daily and leftovers of fish or meat from the kitchen. This provision of food went beyond simple payment for services rendered. It was a clear sign of the cat's accepted place within the domestic sphere, a recognition of it as a member of the household, not just a furry employee. The modern pet boutique, with its racks of tiny sweaters, raincoats, and jeweled collars, would have found a surprisingly receptive market among the medieval aristocracy. Accessories for pets were a major status symbol, a highly visible way to display one's wealth and affection for one's animal companion. Collars were the most common and varied accessory, and they ranged from the purely functional to the breathtakingly opulent. For a simple working dog, a collar might be a plain but sturdy strip of leather, perhaps with a metal ring for a leash. But for a nobleman's prized greyhound, or a lady's cherished lapdog, the collar was a piece of custom jewelry. Surviving household inventories and countless illustrations from the period show collars made of soft velvet, shimmering silk, and fine, dyed leather in vibrant colors like crimson, sapphire blue, and emerald green. These were frequently adorned with elaborate decorations. Silver and gold gilt studs were common, as were small, melodic bells that would create a pleasant chiming sound as the animal moved through the castle halls, announcing its presence. Engraved plates, bearing the owner's coat of arms, served as an early and very clear form of identification tag, instantly marking the animal as the property of a powerful noble. The most luxurious collars were truly spectacular works of art. Imagine a slender greyhound, a favorite of the lady of the castle, its neck encircled by a collar of soft red velvet. From this collar hang tiny, silver gilt bells that chime with every graceful step it takes across the cold stone floor of the great hall. The velvet is studded with polished river pearls, and in the center is a small silver plate engraved with the family crest. This is not an exaggeration. Records from the French royal court in the 14th century describe a collar given by the king to one of his favorite hounds that was made of velvet and adorned with 20 pearls and 11 rubies. The level of craftsmanship lavished on these items was extraordinary, often matching that of the jewelry worn by their human owners. Leashes, too, were often made of fine materials, with woven cords of silk and decorative tassels designed to be seen and admired when the pet was taken out in public. This love of adornment extended to other pets as well. The pet squirrels of noble women, as mentioned, were often fitted with delicate, custom-made silver chains and collars. Birds were housed not in simple wooden cages, but in elaborate architectural creations made of wire, wood, and even precious metals. Gilded cages were a common feature in wealthy homes, designed to be as beautiful as the songbirds they contained. These were not merely functional enclosures, but decorative objects in their own right, a testament to the value placed on the animal within. While there is less evidence for actual clothing for dogs and cats, the practice of dressing up pet monkeys was quite common. As creatures that uncannily mirrored human form and behavior, they were often outfitted in miniature doublets, hats, and gowns, much to the amusement of the court. This practice underscores the anthropomorphic view of these pets. They were seen as little furry people, and dressing them as such was a natural extension of their role as entertainers and companions. The living arrangements for prized pets were a world away from the cold floor of a peasant's hut or the corner of a drafty barn. Noble hunting hounds were housed in purpose-built kennels that were, by the standards of the day, remarkably sophisticated and hygienic. Gaston Phébus's Livre de Chasse once again provides a detailed guide. He describes the ideal kennel as having a wooden floor, raised off the ground to keep the dogs from the damp and the cold. It should have a sunny courtyard attached for them to run and play in, and most remarkably, a fireplace to provide warmth in the winter. He stipulated that the kennel floors should be cleaned every single day, and fresh, clean straw laid down for their bedding. These were not just shelters, but carefully managed living quarters designed for the maximum health and comfort of the valuable animals. A dedicated servant, the dog boy or kennel keeper, was responsible for this upkeep, as well as for the feeding, grooming, and exercising of the hounds. Lapdogs, of course, enjoyed even greater comfort, sharing the living quarters of their owners. They slept in the private chambers of their mistresses, often on soft cushions placed near the bed, or even in the bed itself, tucked under the warm furs and blankets. This level of intimacy, the sharing of a sleeping space, is perhaps the clearest indication of the deep emotional bond and the pet's status as a true member of the family. When it came to healthcare, medieval pet owners operated at the intersection of practical knowledge, folk remedies, and religious faith. For common ailments, there was a body of traditional veterinary wisdom passed down through generations. People knew how to set a broken bone, clean a wound with wine or vinegar, and mix herbal poultices to reduce swelling or fight infection. Hunting manuals contain detailed sections on canine diseases and injuries, with recipes for various salves and tonics. These remedies might involve ingredients like honey for its antiseptic properties, wine, various herbs like comfrey or rosemary, and animal fats. While the scientific basis for these treatments was limited, they represented a genuine and concerted effort to heal their sick and injured animals. However, when practical measures failed, people turned to faith, just as they did for their own illnesses. They prayed to saints for intercession in times of illness for their animals. Saint Francis of Assisi and Saint Anthony Abbot were two of the most important patron saints of animals, and their shrines were often visited by people seeking a cure for an ailing creature. They would light a candle, say a prayer, and leave a small offering in the hope of a miracle for their sick cow, their lame horse, or their beloved dog. One of the most bizarre and fascinating examples of this intersection of faith and veterinary care is the strange case of Saint Gwynfort, the Holy Greyhound. According to a story recorded by the 13th century inquisitor Stephen de Bourbon, Gwynfort was a loyal greyhound belonging to a knight in the region of Lyon, France. One day, the knight and his wife went out, leaving their infant son in his cradle with the faithful Gwynfort to guard him. When the knight returned, he found a scene of horror. The nursery was in disarray, the cradle was overturned, and the dog's mouth and jaws were covered in blood. The baby was nowhere to be seen, leaping to the most terrible conclusion, that the dog had devoured his son. The knight, in a fit of rage and grief, drew his sword and killed Gwynfort on the spot. Only then did he hear a faint cry. He righted the cradle and found his baby, safe and unharmed. But hidden nearby, he discovered the mangled body of a huge viper. The truth dawned on him instantly. Gwynfort had not harmed the child, but had heroically killed the venomous snake to protect him. The blood on his mouth was the viper's, not the baby's. Filled with a terrible remorse, the knight took the dog's body and buried it with great honor in a well, planting a grove of trees around the site to mark it as a sacred place. The local peasants, hearing the story of the faithful, martyred hound, began to venerate the spot. They transformed the dog into a folk saint, Saint Gwynfort, a protector of infants. They would bring their own sick children to the well, leaving offerings and praying to the spirit of the Holy Greyhound in the hopes of a miraculous cure. The official church was, needless to say, horrified by this canine cult. Stephen de Bourbon condemned it as rank superstition and had the dog's remains exhumed and the sacred grove cut down. But the legend of the Holy Greyhound was powerful, and its cult persisted in the region for centuries, a testament to the profound emotional weight that could be placed on an animal, elevating it from a simple pet to a figure worthy of sainthood in the eyes of the common people. In the medieval world, animals were never just animals. They were walking, breathing symbols, their every trait and behavior imbued with complex layers of meaning drawn from scripture, folklore, and the rediscovery of classical tradition. They populated the margins of manuscripts, their playful or monstrous forms interacting with the sacred text. They stared out from the vibrant colors of stained glass windows and were carved into the cold stone of cathedrals, each one telling a story of virtue, vice, faith, or folly. When an animal crossed the threshold of a home and became a pet, it brought this rich tapestry of cultural meaning with it. A pet was not only a source of companionship and affection, it was also a reflection of its owner's identity, a potential spiritual guide, a living moral lesson, or in some cases, a dangerous brush with the forces of darkness. The way medieval society perceived and treated its animal companions was deeply entangled with the era's dominant cultural, religious, and superstitious beliefs, creating a relationship far more complex than simple ownership. In the rigidly hierarchical society of the Middle Ages, every choice was a reflection of one's station, and the choice of a pet was no exception. For the nobility, pets were a crucial part of the performance of status. The greyhound was perhaps the ultimate animal status symbol. With its slender, elegant lines, its incredible speed, and its noble bearing, it was seen as the physical embodiment of the aristocratic ideal. A popular medieval treatise on hunting and chivalry, The Master of Game, described the greyhound as having the head of a snake, the neck of a drake, and the back of a beam. It represented speed, grace, courage, and above all, loyalty. To own a fine greyhound was to possess a living work of art that signaled one's refined taste and noble blood. They are ubiquitous in portraits and tomb effigies of the nobility, often shown resting at their master's or mistress's feet. The presence of the dog was not merely incidental. It was an essential component of the image, reinforcing the subject's identity as a member of the ruling class. The famous tomb effigy of Edward III's son, the Black Prince, in Canterbury Cathedral, features his armored feet resting not on a lion, a common symbol of royal strength, but on a small dog, almost certainly a representation of a beloved and faithful personal companion, immortalized in stone for all eternity. Similarly, the practice of falconry was more than just a sport. It was a complex science and an elegant art form reserved exclusively for the nobility. The type of bird one could fly was strictly dictated by rank. A king might fly a gerfalcon, the largest and most powerful falcon, an earl a peregrine, a knight a saker, and a lady a merlin. The hawk or falcon, perched regally on the gloved fist, was an unmistakable sign of power and privilege. While these were technically working birds, the bond between a falconer and his bird was known to be intensely personal, built on years of patient, painstaking training and the development of mutual trust. The falconer would spend hours with his bird, carrying it on his fist, feeding it by hand, and speaking to it constantly. It was a relationship of deep and quiet intimacy. For scholars and members of the clergy, the preferred companion was often the cat. In this context, the cat symbolized something entirely different from the noble greyhound. It represented a quiet, contemplative, and studious life. The cat's self-sufficiency, its silent, graceful movements, and its patient, unwavering focus on its prey were seen as mirroring the ideal scholarly temperament. The cat was a fitting companion for a life dedicated to quiet observation and learning, a furry muse for the solitary intellectual. This symbolic weight meant that the treatment of a pet was also a reflection of the owner's character. To care for a creature with kindness and generosity was seen as a sign of a gentle and noble spirit. Conversely, cruelty to an animal was often interpreted as a mark of a base and vulgar nature. In the world of medieval romance and poetry, the chivalrous knight is almost always kind to animals, while the villain is often marked by his casual brutality towards them. The pet, therefore, became a mirror, reflecting the inner moral state of its human companion for all the world to see. The official position of the Church on pet ownership was deeply ambivalent. There was no outright prohibition on keeping animals, but the practice was often viewed with deep suspicion, seen as a form of worldly attachment that could distract the soul from its proper focus on God. The resources spent pampering a pet, the fine food, the expensive collars, the dedicated care, were resources that could, and arguably should, have been given to the poor. For a Christian society that placed a high value on charity and austerity, the pampered lapdog was a morally questionable indulgence, a symbol of vanity and misplaced priorities. This criticism was most frequently and forcefully directed at women, particularly nuns. The image of a nun cuddling a small dog or a squirrel was a recurring target for clerical reformers. They saw it as a sign of frivolity, a misplaced affection that diverted a nun's love and devotion away from Christ, her spiritual spouse. The repeated injunctions against keeping pets in convents speak to a constant struggle between the official doctrine of spiritual detachment and the very human need for companionship and affection. For women living a cloistered, highly restricted life, a small animal companion could be an invaluable source of emotional comfort, a living thing to care for and love, in a world that often demanded the suppression of such tender feelings. The authorities saw a sinful luxury, but the nuns themselves likely saw a small spark of warmth and life in their otherwise austere and cold stone surroundings. However, this critical view was not the whole story. The Church also embraced and promulgated the stories of saints who lived in perfect harmony with the animal kingdom. Saint Francis was the ultimate example, but even centuries before him, the Desert Fathers, the early Christian hermits, who sought God in the wilderness, were often depicted with animal companions. The most famous of these was Saint Jerome, who was almost always painted with a lion at his feet. The legend tells that the lion came to him in the desert with a thorn in its paw. Jerome, unafraid, gently removed the thorn, and the grateful lion became his loyal and lifelong companion. In these hagiographies, the animal is not a distraction from God, but a testament to the saint's profound holiness. The saint's purity of soul allows them to communicate with and command the beasts of the field, restoring a fraction of the peace and harmony that existed in the Garden of Eden before the fall of man. This created a paradoxical view within Christian culture. For an ordinary person, lavishing affection on a pet could be a sign of vanity and sin, but for a saint, it could be a sign of divine grace. No animal encapsulates the medieval world's complex and often violently contradictory attitudes more perfectly than the cat. It was simultaneously a cherished companion and a reviled symbol of evil, a welcome presence by the hearth, and a feared agent of the devil. The cat lived a dual life in the medieval imagination, walking a tightrope between adoration and annihilation. On one hand, the cat was a practical and beloved domestic animal. Its value as a predator of mice and rats was incalculable in an agrarian society where stored grain was the key to survival. A single family of rats could devastate a winter's food supply. For this reason, cats were welcomed in homes, monasteries, universities, and even on ships. Beyond their utility, they were admired for their cleanliness, their independence, and their often affectionate nature. As we have seen, they were the favorite pets of scholars and a common sight in domestic settings. There are countless charming illustrations in the margins of manuscripts showing cats engaged in very cat-like behavior, washing themselves meticulously, batting at a dangling thread, or sleeping in a perfect, curled circle. These images show a relationship of easy, everyday affection. On the other hand, a dark and sinister mythology grew up around the cat, tying it inextricably to paganism, witchcraft, and demonic forces. This dark association had several roots. The cat's natural behaviors were often interpreted through a lens of deep superstition. Its nocturnal habits, its silent, stealthy movements, and the eerie way its eyes seemed to glow in the dark made it a creature of the night, a time associated with evil, ghosts, and supernatural danger. Its fierce independence and its resistance to absolute mastery by humans were viewed with suspicion in a culture that prized order and a clear hierarchy. Some of its natural behaviors were also seen as proof of its otherworldly nature. The static electricity that could build up in its fur, its strange and sometimes terrifying cries in the night, and its remarkable ability to survive falls from great heights, all contributed to an aura of supernatural, and therefore suspect, power. This suspicion hardened over time into outright demonization. The cat, and particularly the black cat, came to be seen as the ultimate witch's familiar, a demonic spirit in animal form that was given to a witch by the devil to assist her in her evil deeds. It was widely believed that witches could shapeshift into cats, to travel unseen at night, to spy on their enemies, or to cast malevolent spells. Furthermore, the cat was often directly associated with Satan himself. A devastating papal bull issued by Pope Gregory IX in the 13th century, Vox in Rama, explicitly linked black cats to satanic rituals in Germany, describing them as an incarnation of the devil that was worshipped by heretics. This official condemnation from the highest authority in Christendom gave a theological justification for centuries of fear and persecution. This dark association had horrific consequences for the feline population across Europe. During periods of heightened religious fervor or social anxiety, such as the outbreak of the Black Death, cats were systematically persecuted. They were hunted, tortured, and killed in large numbers, often in brutal public rituals designed to purge the community of evil. On certain saints' days in some parts of Europe, it was customary to throw large numbers of cats onto bonfires. This widespread slaughter of cats may have had a tragically ironic effect. The decimation of the cat population would have allowed the rat population, the primary carriers of the plague-infested fleas, to explode, potentially worsening the spread of the very disease the people were so desperately trying to fight. This dual perception, the cat as a cozy companion versus the cat as a demonic familiar, could and did exist simultaneously, sometimes even in the same community or the same individual. A person could lovingly stroke their own pet cat, their trusted mouser, Malkin, by the fire, while simultaneously believing that their neighbor's cat was a witch in disguise and deserving of a cruel death. This paradox lies at the heart of the medieval worldview, a place where everyday reality was constantly and fluidly interwoven with a vibrant and often terrifying supernatural landscape. The humble cat, more than any other animal, walked the fine line between the domestic and the demonic, the beloved and the damned. As we draw back the heavy tapestry of history, a surprising and endearing picture comes into focus. The medieval world, so often painted in shades of gray, a world of hardship, war, and plague, was also a place filled with the warmth and color of animal companionship. The bond between humans and their pets, which we tend to think of as a modern sensibility, was in fact a vibrant and integral part of life 1,000 years ago. We have seen that the desire to share one's life with an animal transcended the rigid boundaries of social class. From the king with his noble greyhounds, living symbols of his power and grace, to the peasant with his scruffy but loyal terrier, a partner in the daily struggle for survival, the connection was there. We have discovered a world of unexpected pets, where noble ladies doted on tame squirrels with silver collars, and courts were amused by the antics of monkeys dressed in miniature silks. This tells us of a human fascination with the animal kingdom that went far beyond mere utility, a desire to connect with and cherish creatures for their beauty, their novelty, and their unique personalities. The medieval pet owner, at least in the upper echelons of society, was not so different from their modern counterpart, seeking out companions that were both a source of personal joy and a reflection of their own identity and status. Perhaps most strikingly, we have unearthed a culture of pet pampering that rivals our own in its devotion, if not its technology. We have seen evidence of specially prepared diets, of luxurious, custom-made accessories that were effectively jewelry for animals, and of a genuine and deep concern for the health and comfort of these creatures. The image of a nobleman's kennel, complete with a fireplace and daily housekeeping, or the story of a marchioness commissioning a grand tomb for her deceased cat, shatters the illusion of a purely pragmatic medieval mindset. These were acts of love, clear and resonant across the centuries. They reveal that the impulse to spoil a beloved pet, to treat it as a true member of the family, is a deeply ingrained and timeless aspect of the human heart. We have also navigated the complex and often contradictory landscape of medieval belief, where an animal could be both a saint and a demon, a symbol of divine grace, and a tool of the devil. The strange tale of St. Gwynfort, the holy greyhound, and the brutal, widespread persecution of cats show us a world where the lines between the natural and the supernatural were blurred, where animals were laden with a heavy burden of symbolic meaning. This adds a layer of complexity to their story, reminding us that their lives, like the lives of the people they lived with, were governed by a worldview profoundly different from our own. Ultimately, what this journey into the past reveals is a shared humanity. When we read the simple, heartfelt words of the 9th century monk describing his quiet companionship with his cat, Pangurban, we are closing a gap of 1,200 years. In his affection, we recognize our own. The medieval people who loved their pets were not so different from us. They experienced the same joy at a playful greeting, the same comfort in a quiet, purring presence, the same profound grief at the loss of a faithful friend. By uncovering the lost history of their pets, we uncover a more intimate, more relatable history of them. We see them not as distant, one-dimensional figures in a history book, but as people who lived, breathed, and loved. People who, like us, found a special and enduring solace in the simple, unwavering loyalty of an animal companion. The world has changed immeasurably, but the timeless, fundamental nature of that bond remains very much the same.